Wanted to take a look at the Reading 17 study questions on Mill. I believe this is the chapter 2 of Mill's utilitarianism. Just some general questions which I hope will kind of clarify things like what he is up to in this reading, especially the first question, what is a criterion? And I meant that generally, not a specifically moral criterion, just a general concept of a criterion. A criterion is a standard that we can refer to make judgments. That's important to see in general, and then to say, well, he's looking for a moral criterion. He's looking for a criterion, looking for a standard that we can use as a reference, a standard for making moral judgments. You can also think of the criterion as being a principle, a guiding principle, so that if we are deciding to do something, by reference to this principle, we would, generally speaking, get the correct answer. So a good criterion would be one that was a reliable reference, a standard for making judgments, in this case, moral judgments. It's pretty obvious that his criterion is the greatest happiness principle, that the pleasure is the good and pain is bad. And so, roughly speaking, when we're thinking of doing anything, we try to judge the consequences of the actions in terms of their impact on human happiness, whether they increase pleasures or whether they cause pain. Of course, it has to be sort of ironed out in terms of that, but that's generally speaking the criterion, the moral criterion. But a criterion in general is a standard that we use to actually make judgments in particular cases. Number 2, why does Mill think it is more important in morality than other fields? I'm sure it shouldn't say, shouldn't say duty there, it should say study. I'm very sorry. That must have been quite confusing. But a typo on my part, I did not mean to write duty there, I meant to write study, because what he discusses in the beginning of this is that there are plenty of other fields of study, like mathematics and natural science, physics, in which the first principles are not worked out, but it doesn't really matter. And he mentions algebra in particular. Algebra is doing fine in terms of, and again, I apologize, that fields of duty, that must have been so confusing. I really apologize. I meant fields of study. If something doesn't make sense, and that doesn't make any sense, you should really contact me. You should not hesitate, because if it doesn't make sense, it means I made a mistake. So I apologize. But a field of study like algebra is doing fine in terms of the progress of algebra and the reliability of algebraic methods. But the first principles are really murky. No one really knows how to articulate the first principles of algebra. At least they didn't when Mill was writing in the 1860s. I don't know about today. But morality is different. In morality, you have to know the end or the goal of your action in order to know what to do. So the question of first principles is much more prominent in morality, because we have to know what principles we're trying to promote or uphold or obey in order to make a decision at all, whereas you don't need to know the first principles of algebra in order to solve an algebraic equation. Number 3, I suggest in the video that Mill thought Kant was a secret utilitarian. Why? Well, if you think about he mentions the first version of the categorical imperative about universalizability. Act only so that your maxim of action can serve as a law for everyone. When it comes to actually applying that categorical imperative, using it as a standard, it turns out that the only way we can do it is if we think like utilitarians, because we're thinking, well, I'm thinking of doing this thing, and here is my maxim of action, my rule of action. Can that be a law for everyone? Well, we imagine what the effects of everyone following that maxim would be, and if they're bad, that is, if they're generally speaking, if they're bad for human welfare, then we say that we can't do it. And if they're good or neutral, then we say that we can. So what Mill is saying is that Kant although he wouldn't admit it, was using the greatest happiness principle, the utilitarian principle, without really acknowledging it. Once again, I really apologize for that fields of duty thing. It makes no sense. I meant fields of study. Yeah, moving on to the next set of study questions for the last Mill reading. Number one, what does Mill mean when he talks of the sanction of the greatest happiness principle? What sort of question is he raising? Well, sanction means authority here. Like, what gives the greatest happiness principle authority over us so that we would be obliged to follow it? So the sort of question he's raising is the question of why we should feel compelled to follow the greatest happiness principle. What gives it its force? What makes it a duty for us to follow it, or what obliges us to follow it? So that's the question he's raising. Number two, does Mill believe that the greatest happiness principle is part of human nature? He's a little bit uncertain about that. Is the greatest happiness principle actually embedded in human nature? I don't know. He certainly thinks that it doesn't go of itself. That Mill is one of those thinkers, those 19th century progressive thinkers who really emphasizes education. And what he's really concerned with is creating a society in its laws and in its education that would nurture respect for and feeling for the greatest happiness principle in people and embody it in legislation. So whether or not he thinks the greatest happiness principle is part of human nature, probably not. But he does think that it is very harmonious with human nature. That is, that we find it agreeable and it makes sense to us. And although our selfishness or our superstitions may get in the way of us following it, we kind of follow it naturally. It may not be a part of our nature, but it can easily become part of our second nature, in the sense that we find it rational and plausible, and the more that we follow it, the more that we want to follow it, I think. So it may not be part of human nature, but it's definitely harmonious with human nature, and it is something that he thinks can be cultivated naturally in human nature as part of education. Number three, why does Mill believe that the greatest happiness principle is a part of the advance of civilization? Well, for him, and maybe he's old-fashioned, he's a British thinker at the height of the British Empire, basically, and thinking that Western morality is really the only one that's really enlightened, and it is probably really kind of old-fashioned and maybe even backward in that respect. But he does think, and it's a serious claim, that advance in civilization means taking everyone's interests into account. That is, as civilization advances, when every member of the community, every person within the group is thought to be worthwhile, and that their interests should be taken into account, in the sense that every time we make a law, every time we create an institution, every time we do anything, say, in the public sphere, it should be for the benefit of the greatest number, because everybody counts. So Mill believes that the greatest happiness principle, do that which causes the greatest amount of happiness in general, is really a fundamental part of the idea of a decent society. And it's a very strong claim. I happen to believe that he's right. That is, that we can see that our societies become better when more and more people, and ideally everyone, matters. And everyone matters if we take their happiness, their welfare into account. So that if you're a member of a particular ethnic group or a gender group or in some way a religious group, and your happiness is not taken into account equally with everyone else, then that's bad. I think we all kind of believe that. So I'm not saying that Mill doesn't have his problems, but the basic idea there is really worth thinking about. And for Mill, the idea is that a society progresses when the people within it are treated with respect. It's kind of, maybe it's a little Kantian in that respect.